Hi there, it's Sasha Townsend again. This is going to be the last video in my series over standards-based grading. I did a 35-minute presentation for the Teaching and Learning Showcase at TCC about a week ago now. And ever since, I felt like, oh, I really wish I had more time. I wish I had really dug into that topic. And so I've expanded it and I've made it maybe too long, but I think that there are some really important ideas here, and I wanted to share them with you. So this is probably going to be the most ambitious of the videos. The first video was talking about standards-based grading face-to-face. So if you want to learn how to implement standards-based grading in your classroom, you want to watch that video. The second video was a transitional video, and it was describing how I tried to transition a face-to-face standards-based grading course system for 3 classes in the spring 2020 semester to an online SBG, on the fly because of the pandemic. I also made some changes to the other courses I was teaching as well, and all of that is described in the second video. But that's just really outlining my journey and what I did and what I learned from that first iteration of trying to do standards-based grading online. In this video, I'm going to share with you how I applied standards-based grading in fall 2020 and spring 2021 in the current semester, and just some frameworks for us to explore regarding how to redesign our courses, how to rethink course design in a more student-centered way. Now, I am not what is it called? The instructional designer. That was the word. I'm not an instructional designer. I don't have a lot of formal training in this, but I have lots and lots of informal training and lots of curiosity about how to better serve my students. So I'm going to share some ideas with you that I haven't heard at the professional development for online course developer training at TCC. So this is the title slide. It says Logistics and Challenges 3.0, Lessons from 5 Years of Standards-Based Grading. This is where I transitioned from to online SBG for fall 2020 and spring of 2021. But again, this is really not just about standards-based grading, but about how we can design student-centered courses in general. So here is the practice. Here's the process. It's a test, iterate process. The students learn the material, then they practice the material, usually in cooperative learning in class. Then I assess them over their understanding the material, and then I give them some feedback, and then they practice more based on the feedback and based on everything that they've learned so far, and then they have the opportunity to reassess, and then they repeat. It's a test, iterate process where you find out how much you know, you learn from that, and then you try again. And then you find out how much you know and you learn from that and you try again. And you keep learning new things and you keep repeating this process for course standard after course standard throughout the entire semester. That's really what standards-based grading is, but it's a framework that we could actually apply to designing our courses as well. So I'm going to bring that up in just a moment. But again, here's the outline of the 3 videos that I've made so far over these lessons from standards-based grading. That first one was about face-to-face standards-based grading and why it worked so well, and the rationale behind it and all of those detailed. So if you're interested in implementing face-to-face grading or face-to-face standard-based grading in your classroom, I highly recommend you check that out. The second video is my pandemic pivot to online SBG. It's really just telling to what happened in 2020 and the lessons that I learned from that. You'll see if you watch that video that there were many lessons to be learned. There were many things that did not go as smoothly as we would have hoped, as I would have hoped for my students. But I absolutely did the best I could and learned from that as my first iteration of this experience of moving standards-based grading online. And then in this video, I'm going to talk about my lessons from 5 years with standards-based grading and also some other frameworks. So we're going to talk about student-centered design with design thinking as described by the D School at Stanford. They are experts on design thinking, and they have a framework for creative problem solving that I think that we can apply as we test and iterate through this process of creating better and better courses for our students. And I also wanted to bring in this other piece. When we are creating a student-centered design in our courses, we're always addressing equity issues. Um, I think equity and empathy are linked. If you are truly empathizing with your students, then you see them. We see the diversity of privilege. We just see diversity in just our classroom in general, and all of the different ways that our students are diverse, all the different ways that they have privilege and that they lack privilege, and all the ways that we are having them in the room, but perhaps not including them, and how we can include rather than exclude people. Um, and then how to, with all of that in mind, provide the same, not the same educational experience, but I would say an equally valuable educational experience for all students. Um, so this video is particularly ambitious, but let's just get started. So what is design thinking? Well, according to the design school, it is a framework for creative problem solving. And this is the rough outline of what it is. It says, first, you empathize with the people that you want to serve. So rather than saying, oh, I've got this idea for solving some problem, you actually go to the people and you find out what their experiences are, and you find out what it's like to be them, so that you're not maybe solving a problem that they don't have, but instead recognizing what their needs are by really getting to know them. And then after you have gotten to know the people that you want to serve, then you define the problem, you define many things, and we'll look at that on the next slide. And then you come up with ideas. It's a very yes and mentality. If you've ever done improv, we'll talk about that in a minute. You come up with ideas to solve that problem that you have now defined, and you've defined well. And that problem arose from empathizing with the people that you're serving. And then you prototype. You do this fast. You design something and then try it out. And then if it doesn't work, you tweak it and you tweak it, and you do this over and over again. You test it, and then you repeat. The prototyping and testing process repeats a lot. And I think it also goes back to the idea, or the ideate part of this process. So there's a lot of looping back. But of course, like, the core of this is to focus on the students and their needs. So at TCC, we have the Design Institute for student-centered course design. And we talk a lot about how we can create a course that is sort of warm. And you might think that the design thinking was really about designing a syllabus or writing a syllabus that was really focused on making the students feel comfortable and making the classroom and the faculty feel approachable. But this is that, but this is more than that. So that was the rough outline of how this works. And here's some more detail. And I actually just grabbed this off the internet. I did not cite this very well at all. So this is the Empathize Set Step. So you interview people, you shadow them, you seek to understand where they're coming from. You're not judging. You're not saying, oh, you should do things this way, or you should think this way, or maybe you should have different study skills, or maybe you should work less, or any of those things. Instead, you're just getting to know the students from where they are and what they're going through. And these are some ways that you might do that when we apply this to the classroom environment. And then this is the definition step. This is where we can define the challenges, the pain points, our role, and our objectives for the types of problems that we're trying to solve, and make some decisions about what needs to be done. So what's great about this is these first two steps are really helping us to define the problem and understand the problem before we try to solve it. If we incorrectly diagnose the problem, if we say, oh, that was really good, or, this is the problem, then everybody just comes together and goes into that brainstorm mode that we would see over here in the ideate stage, or the ideate step in this process. We might solve the wrong problem. So these two steps are really important to ensuring that our design is student-centered. But then after we've done that, after we sort of know where the students are coming from, and we've defined exactly what it is that we want to do for them, and when I think of course design, that's involving defining our course learning outcomes and defining, what are our goals for our students? What are they exactly? And when we have course learning outcomes, CLOs, we have program learning outcomes, PLOs, we have institutional learning outcomes, ILOs, all of those should mean something. Those are not just boxes that we check off for some accrediting body. Of course, we want to be accredited, but that's not what they're supposed to be for. We want those CLOs, PLOs, and ILOs, those learning outcomes, to really serve our students. And if we define them well, they will serve our students. They won't just be boxes that we're checking off, but instead they will reflect what our goals for our students are and what we intend to deliver on, our promise to our students as they continue to take our courses. So you empathize with the students, you define the course learning outcomes based on your understanding of their experience, and then you think about, okay, well, how can I meet their needs? And then you do this brainstorming process. I love that they listed here yes and thinking. I have a little bit of a theater background. If you've ever been a theater kid or done anything with improv, then you know what this yes and is. So it's just like a game. This yes and game is a game, an improv game, where somebody starts the scene and they're doing something, and then somebody else walks in, and you're not allowed to disagree with them. You can't, somebody can't say, oh, I'm this person and you're my wife, or you're my partner, and then the other person walks in the scene and says, no, I'm not. I mean, it just would destroy the scene. Instead of doing that, you're supposed to agree and say, yes, I am that, and I'm this, and you build, and everybody adds something, and no one is criticizing. And it's very creative and inclusive and celebratory. All ideas are worthy. We're sharing ideas, and seeing sort of what ideas sort of converge on a bigger idea, or how the ideas like separate. So as you come up with all of these ideas, it's very easy to just sort of clump them and say, oh, these kind of go together, and these kind of go together, and these kind of go together, and like, what's the main idea here, and what are we actually getting at, and what's good about these ideas? And you can do that after you have taken the time to make all ideas worthy and consider everything in this brainstorming process. And then with the prototyping, you might do a storyboard. You're going to try something, see if it works. If it doesn't work, you get some feedback. If you do this with students, you want to find out if the students are liking this, if it's working. And if it is working, great. And if it's not working, you tweak it and you just make those changes. Now, I know that all of us do this if we're teaching courses. Everyone will say, oh, that's a great idea, and they'll implement it for the next semester. And we wait about 4 months. And then at the end of the semester, we might read our student course evaluations, student evaluations of our courses and our teaching as well. And we might say, okay, well, how did that work 4 months later? With this design thinking process, the idea is that the feedback would happen much faster than that. So we would try something, and then rather than waiting 4 months, or rather than waiting until next semester, rather than doing this test iterate 3 times a year, spring, summer, fall, instead we are doing this maybe every couple of weeks or something like that. We have to be careful though as teachers. The students need a sense of continuity. They need to know what to expect. So we need to provide that for them. But we also need to be, flexible enough to throw out things when they don't work. So where we can, we need to try things and then find out what works and then modify them. And then that's consistent with this testing stage. So you try it. If it doesn't work, what didn't work about it, then do it again, do it differently. So you might think to yourself that like there's nothing particularly exciting about this process. You're like, okay, of course we correctly identify the problem before we try to solve it. And of course we empathize with our customers or the people that are using our services, in this case, taking our classes. Of course we would do that first. The reason I bring this up is that we don't tend to do this. We tend to do what we've always done. Um, so I think there is a place for remembering that um, that we really need the input of the students. We really need this empathize step, and we need to clearly define what it is we're trying to do for our students, which is why I love the course learning outcomes and the program learning outcomes and the institutional learning outcomes. We need to clearly define all of that before we start brainstorming of like, how do we deliver this? For me, that definition step is not just course learning outcomes, program learning outcomes, and institutional learning outcomes, but it's also best practices. Like, I don't want to reinvent the wheel. If other people have found out, have discovered, have researched and spent, years of their lives, sometimes, entire careers, learning about what works for students and their learning, especially when it comes to learning math. Like, I want to know about that, because I don't want to have to go through this test iterate process. If somebody else has already come up with this sort of nugget of knowledge, I want to take that and incorporate it in my classroom. So not only are we defining all of those learning outcomes, we're also defining, okay, what goes into a good course? Okay, how can I give them the right feedback? How can I ensure that the students are motivated to study? And that's where a lot of the things that I did with standards-based grading are appropriate, because they fit in terms of being ideas that allow us to meet the best practices, or allow us to carry out the best practices that are known in education for how students learn, how people learn. So in this definition step, I want to define the learning outcomes for the students, but I also want to define what actually encourages the students to learn the learning outcomes. We want them to get to the learning outcome phase. We want them to get to that step. They can't get to that step if we haven't designed well and designed a course in ways that serve them, that serve their experience. So that empathy and definition step, they go hand in hand, because you have to understand your students to know what will work for them. We also need to understand the research to know what will work for them, and then we need to put all of those together with our goals for them. And our goals are hopefully, sort of long-term and beyond our class and into their careers, but also into their next few years of school. We don't want to send people on to the big university. If we're community college, we don't want to send people on to the university without the skills that they need to succeed there. So, we have to think short-term and long-term about all of this. So this design thinking process, may seem obvious, but I bring it up because it's not something that we're already doing, unfortunately. We have a tendency to keep doing the same thing over and over, and you know what they say about that. We're doing the same thing over and over, hoping to get different results. And the students who have learned to deal with this thing that we're doing over and over, they're doing just fine. But we're missing some of them. We're leaving some of them behind. And I know it's on my heart, and I know it's on the hearts of many faculty and educators to not leave as many students behind. And that doesn't mean that everybody passes and we guarantee that everybody gets a passing grade, but it does mean that everybody gets a quality education. And if someone doesn't get what they're supposed to get out of that class that semester, we encourage them. Sometimes it's going to take longer. We encourage them to come back and try again the following semester. So this is what I'm hoping that we will apply here. So, getting back to that empathy step, and this is a little harsh. Maybe I shouldn't have even included this slide. Here, we've got this activity. We've got these students sitting at a table. They've got their teacher over here. My question to you is your course about the students, or is it about you? Is it about them, or is it about you? It's a very simple question. Now, don't get me wrong. If you come into my math classroom, you're often going to see me at the front of the class talking about calculus like this. And if I have an interested group of students behind me, like this gentleman has, like that's fantastic. I'm very happy if I've got a whole class paying that close of attention to me, and I'm doing that good a job at being engaging. But I just include this slide to make a point. When we design, it can't be designing with, it can't be designing our courses to be the best college class that we've ever had, in the sense that, oh, well, I really liked it when the professor did this, and this was impressive, and this was impressive. It's not about us being impressive. I mean, I could stand up at the board and do proofs all day and make the students confident in my competence, but if they don't become more competent through taking my course, I have not yet done my job. So it can't be about me showing off how good I am at math. It has to be about me helping them become really good at math. And that means I want my classroom to look more like this person's classroom as opposed to this person's classroom. Now, again, there's a place for lecture. We have to deliver content somehow, and we want to make it engaging when we do. I'm making a lecture right now, and I'm posting it on YouTube, so it's even less engaging because you're not physically with me. So there's definitely a place for that type of content delivery. But ultimately, we want everything to be about the students and student-centered. And that will involve some cooperative learning, but these pictures are really just to illustrate an idea that it should be about them, not about us. Now, let's go back to standards-based grading. In the last couple of videos, I've talked about standards-based grading, and when it works well, this is basically how it works. The students are going to learn through lectures, discussions, and videos. I usually lecture for about the first hour of class. And then the last 20 minutes or the last 50 minutes, depending on the class, will be some cooperative learning. Or if it's an earlier class like Calculus 1 or Calculus 2, there will be a lecture and then some practice, and a lecture and then some practice, and we sort of take turns through all of that. But there's a little bit of content delivery and a little bit of practice. So they learn and then they practice. And then what's so great about standards-based grading when we do this in the face-to-face environment is that in almost all of my classes, the study groups would form organically. I didn't have to force this to happen. I didn't have to assign groups. Students would just sort of look around the room and say, hey, are you doing anything after class? What's your schedule look like? And they would form a study group. I would do my office hours in the math lab about 10 hours a week. I would sit at a desk in the very back of the math lab, and there was a table with a huge whiteboard next to it, actually next to one of my colleagues' offices on the other side of the lab. My students would come and camp out there. They would be there for hours, and they would stand there explaining problems to each other, working out their homework problems together. And then whenever they got stuck on a problem, one student might come over and ask for help if they got stuck. Or if they were all stuck, they might be like, Miss Townsend, can you come over here? And I would go to their table and I would help them. And sometimes they would ask me to just come over and look at their work on the whiteboard, and I would just bring a red marker, bring a marker in a different color and start marking it and correcting it the same way that I would correct a quiz, and I'd say, yes, that's good, but here, let's change this, and here, let's change that. And I would tweak it, and I would help them, and I would give them feedback. And this would happen during office hours without any prompting from me. I wouldn't say the course design and my choice to do office hours in the math lab created this environment where this happened, which is why I say that it happened organically. And then the students will take a reassessment when they feel ready. So sometimes if a student needs to reassess, they would say, oh, Miss Townsend, I'm not really sure if I'm ready for that reassessment on first order linear ODEs. Can you give me a practice one? So I'd take out my Diffie book and I'd give them a practice problem, and they practice, and then I might even give them some feedback on the practice problem before they take the actual reassessment. And then when they say they feel ready, I give them a new quiz, and then they take the quiz and hopefully improve their score. So then as a student watches their grade improve, they're studying more. And I talked about this in the first video. There was actually a student who said, and I don't remember if her grade went from a 1 to a 3, or was it a 1 to a 3.5 or a 4? I don't remember if it was a D to an A or a D to a B, but it was a huge jump, a multi-point jump in the student's understanding. And the student was like, Miss Townsend, you really, all I have to do is study and learn. All I have to do is learn. And then this happens. I'm like, yes, all you have to do is learn. But when I say all you have to do is learn, you have to realize that there is so much involved in that learning. I'm not saying this is going to be an easy A. All of this that the students are doing with the studying and explaining problems to each other and asking for help, all of that is part of what made this so successful. It's not the structure that created the learning. It was the students' work that created the learning, and the students' work was incentivized by the structure. So the structure was just like creating this shell where all of these good things could happen, and it happened beautifully on campus. Now, it doesn't always work that way for every student, but it worked that way for the majority of students. And occasionally there would be some students who were working very hard, but they were left behind because they did not have the prerequisite knowledge that they needed in order to succeed as quickly as their peers. And because they weren't succeeding as quickly as their peers, they're getting farther and farther behind with the material, and they had trouble getting caught up. So I think that there's absolutely something to be said about how do we help those students, because we don't want them to drop out of college and not get a college degree. We want to serve them just as well as we've served the students that are ready to learn like this. But when it works well, when the deficiencies aren't too great, when you just have a few things that you've forgotten that you need to brush up on, this process of, making mistakes, learning from the mistakes and trying again, and then getting feedback that whole time from your professor, and then working with your classmates who are on your team and explaining problems to each other. That is what created the learning in a standards-based grading classroom. So why does all of this work? It worked well because the design was seamless. When I say seamless, I mean that the lecture was aligned with the practice activity, and then the practice, which was not just happening in cooperative learning in class, but also happening in the math lab, was aligned with the assessment. And then they would get feedback that was detailed and written by a human grader that cared about them and cared about their learning. And so I'm giving them feedback that is mostly positive. I try to say lots of positive things, but I'm also saying, oh, don't forget your DX, don't forget your plus C. Oh, you made this algebra error. You tried to distribute this, but that doesn't really distribute that way. Let me explain it to you. And so I would write all of that on their quizzes. They get that feedback, and then after they get that feedback, they have the opportunity to do it again. And it's because of the alignment between the lectures, the activities, the homework, the assessments, the feedback, and the reassessment that it worked really well, because everybody understood exactly what was expected of them. It was all outlined on the course standards document as described in the first video over standards-based grading. But it was also just aligned. The lecture, the practice, and the assessments were aligned. It also works because the students understand the rationale. There was one semester when I tried to do this at TU, and it took several months for the students at TU to understand why they were taking quizzes over and over again. And when they did not understand why they were taking quizzes over and over again, it didn't work, because they felt like I'm just supposed to learn through taking stuff over and over again. But of course, you're not going to learn just through mindless repetition. It's, what do they say in music? It's not practice that makes perfect. It's perfect practice that makes perfect. That might stress a person out because they might think they have to be perfect. You don't have to be perfect. but it is attentive practice. It is focused practice. It is practice where you are trying to get closer to that ideal, that really helps. And so it's not just doing the quiz over and over again, it's taking the quiz and then having that focused practice in between where you are learning from your mistakes and you're learning how to learn and you're figuring out how this works and then trying again. That really works. And if students understand that, um, and they feel that all they have to do is study to learn, and then all they have to do is learn to get the grades they want, then it works really well. And it's a snowball effect where um, learning begets more studying, which begets more learning, and all of that begets higher grades. It's good stuff. It's very good stuff when students understand the rationale and everything is designed seamlessly. Again, it's providing incentives for studying. The study groups formed organically, face to face. And I am actually pretty lax about deadlines. One thing that I have sometimes quietly challenged my colleagues with is this idea that, are we here to teach our students responsibility or are we here to teach them math? Because I can teach them responsibility by saying, nope, I will not accept the paper after this day. I will not accept the quiz after this time. I will not accept this after that. You have to learn by this day. Otherwise, sorry, you missed your chance. And that's pretty much what we say whenever we give them an exam or 4 exams during the semester. Say, you can still learn it. You're just not going to get any points for it if you learn it after the exam. And I know you've got other classes, but I hope that you learn it before the final because it might be on the final. They're just going to skip that one. I mean, that might happen. They might just skip that one. But I guess my point is that when I have deadlines in my course, I only include them because I know my students need them. And I know my students need them because if I don't have deadlines for, say, homework, they won't do their homework on time. So I will have a 1 point late penalty on homework, which means that they can't get an A on the homework if they submit it late. They can only get the highest grade that they can get is a B. But I want them to do it late, which is why I'm giving them the opportunity to earn up to a B for doing all of that homework later. It's much more important to me that they do it than that they do it by a certain time. I need them to do it by the end of the semester. And I don't want the end of the semester to be too stressful for me or for them. I want everything, the material and their learning of the material to be spread out over, months. That's how it's supposed to be. But I'm pretty lax about deadlines. I tell them I can't be that way about math. The angel of mathematics is very strict. You've got to do your mathematics right. But when it comes to deadlines, I absolutely can work with a student on deadlines. And they know that they have a professor or coach in their corner. And their classmates are their teammates. Okay. So when this works, it works because it's like a family. They feel like they've got someone like me that's on their side that wants to see them succeed, that will give them the tough love that they need. They've got their classmates that are on their team, also on their side. Everybody wants to see everyone else succeed. The study groups are forming, which actually makes success possible. They've got incentives for studying just through the course design. If they understand the rationale behind the studying, then they're more likely to do it. And then the lessons themselves and the practice and the assessments are seamless. So that's why it works when it works well. So the promises of Sbg are these. No matter who is teaching using standards-based grading, students will have the opportunity to reassess over course standards. And at least in my class, my promise was that course standards would comprise 75 to 80% of the final grade. So I just want to go back to this again. This standards-based grading is really an idea. It's an idea that's based on course learning outcomes that were well-defined, and those course learning outcomes that were well-defined were also associated with well-defined activities that we knew would lead to learning. The types of activities that are supported by research. And my favorite book, my favorite reference on that is Susan Ambrose's How Learning Works. Sort of there are 7 things that we should consider, 7 principles that we should consider, and standards-based grading addresses all of them. But you might say, well, aren't you just jumping to the idea? Aren't you failing to empathize with the students in this process? How do you know that this is working for the students most of the time? And I know that it's working for the students most of the time because I've talked to them. There are some students, though, that are getting that sort of feel overwhelmed and they sort of get left behind, and I don't like that at all. So I think that in the future, at least for me, I need to do some more interviews and seeking to understand in a non-judgmental way with the students who aren't taking their quizzes on time, who are afraid to get feedback. I find in the past, the students that are struggling with this process have struggled because of something like having a fixed mindset as opposed to a growth mindset. They feel like the constructive criticism is an attack when it's intended to be supportive and constructive, the way a coach would somebody coaching you would be constructive. All of that. So there's definitely something to going back as well. I'm not saying that standards-based grading is the answer to all of this, and that's why I bring this design thinking piece up. We don't have to stay here with this one idea and say, how can we make everything else fit the idea? That's not the point. The students are the point. We need to empathize with them first, but then we need to define what we're going to do. And when we define what we're going to do, that means we're defining learning outcomes, and we're defining how we're going to do it so they actually learn, or defining what principles need to underlie what we do so that they actually learn, like what principles are important in our course design. And once we have those principles, then we can come over here to ideate and talk about, well, how do we create opportunities for quality feedback? Is it different face-to-face as opposed to online? Maybe it is. Sometimes it is. How do we create, this, or how do we design something that is aligned with this particular principle that we know supports learning? I think we need to stop staying married to the means as far as getting our students or getting our courses into a particular framework and then trying to force the framework to fit. We need to change the framework. We need to come up with solutions, come up with ideas that actually address what we're trying to do. And so I just wanted to go back to that empathize piece, that even as I talk about the lessons from standards-based grading, we need to go back to empathy. We need to go back to figuring out how the students are experiencing this. I know my students love it, and that's why I keep doing it semester after semester. Even when I went online and it was harder, they still said that they loved it. And so I said, okay, I'll keep doing it. If you guys still like it, all right, well then, if you still like it, I'll keep doing it. But yeah, we need to keep empathizing, and we need to keep defining the principles that will underlie our teaching, and then the learning outcomes that we're seeking for the students, and then coming up with ideas that are based on those. Okay, so how did I make changes for analytic geometry and calculus 3 in fall 2020 and spring 2021? Well, the only way that I could find to use standards-based grading in the online environment was to use Webassign Quizzes. So I used Webassign Quizzes covering our 30 course standards. Now, there are problems with this. The quizzes my students were taking face-to-face, they were taking those quizzes once a week in class. I wrote them, so the alignment was much better. The lecture was much more clearly linked to the types of problems that would be on that written quiz that I created. And then they were getting written feedback from me, and they were being graded on their methodology and their reasoning as opposed to their answers. In Webassign, it's either right or it's wrong. And I can't if I have individual quizzes for each of the individual standards, which is what I had to do when I took my standards-based grading quizzes and I put them online, and I give students multiple attempts at these, if every student has 2 attempts at each standard or 8 attempts at each standard, because my students are able to correct their work 4 times per quiz for 2 quizzes, um, and that's getting into details that I don't want to get into. But if they have 8 attempts to correct work, I can't grade 240 attempts for those students that are taking the Webassign quizzes. So I am using Webassign to administer these quizzes, but now the students have to be more accurate and they're not getting feedback. They have to self-assess whether or not they're understanding it. They have to see if they're getting the right answer. Webassign will tell them whether they're right or whether they're wrong. And then if they're wrong, they have to take initiative and say, Miss Townsend, I really didn't understand, problem number 3 on quiz number 7. Can you go over that problem with me? So they have to be much more proactive, and I don't think all students are ready for that. Even in Calculus 3, which is a course that they would be taking in their 2nd year or perhaps 3rd year at TCC, depending on where they started in the math sequence. But the Webassign quizzes are aligned with the Webassign homework, and they are aligned to the videos and lesson notes imperfectly. So the videos that I created and the lesson notes I created were for the standards-based grading course in the face-to-face environment. So when I went online, I had to try to find Webassign problems that were assessing the same ideas that were being assessed on the quizzes that I wrote, the quizzes that the students would write their solutions on, handwrite their solutions on. So the alignment is not perfect, and it would take time to make it perfect. And if I were to make the alignment perfect to the Webassign quizzes and TCC were to decide to change books, then I would have to redesign everything. And I guess we do that every time we adopt a new textbook. We do redesign for that textbook often. But I think there are 113 videos in Calculus 3, and I don't think I would be able to remake 113 videos every time we got a new textbook. Um, well, I mean, I could, but basically what I would be doing is I would be conforming to the learning outcomes presented by the publisher and conforming to the learning outcomes that were most important to the author of the book, and having to abandon some of the learning outcomes that I have for my students. Like I prefer to include a lot of conceptual questions that sort of tie ideas together and help students see the big picture. Those aren't on the online homework platforms that are available right now. There are a few conceptual questions, and there are some very good ones for the statistics text that we use at TCC. But in calculus, there are less conceptual questions in the online homework, and I'm not able to write them myself, or I could write them myself, but it would take a while. It'd take some training for me to learn to write my own Webassign problems and then incorporate them, or then share them with everybody else who uses Webassign. But that's what I'm doing right now in my online analytic geometry and calculus 3. In fall 2020, they had 4 attempts. They had 4 versions of each of these quizzes. And in spring 2021, I changed the settings a little bit. So now they have 2 versions of the quizzes, but within each quiz, they can reattempt problems 4 times, which is a little too detailed, but for our purposes. But the idea is that the students have the opportunity to learn from their mistakes and correct their mistakes. But they're not getting that detailed feedback that they were getting before. And I'm having to tailor my materials to the materials offered by the book. And I do that a little bit. And I think we have to do that a little bit every time we change books. But I would prefer not to have to redo 113 videos, especially when Calculus 3 itself hasn't changed, just our book has changed. I think that faculty should be the one defining those learning outcomes, as opposed to letting the textbook authors lead. as much respect as I have for you guys, I would love to write a textbook someday. Um, I, you know, if somebody is using my book, I don't want to force them to have to do it my way. Um, I want everybody to have sort of that open source flexibility where they can do it whatever way they want. So my students have 4 attempts to submit, and the highest score stands rather than the most recent score. In the face-to-face standards-based grading course, I always have the most recent score stand. So that way students aren't taking quizzes over and over when they're not ready for them. But when you're doing what we're doing with these Webassign quizzes, where the students aren't able to get detailed feedback, they're not getting detailed feedback from a human grader, but instead they're just being told, you're wrong, you're right, maybe you should go read this part of the book. And they're like, okay, but I read that already and it didn't help me. In that environment, it felt right to me to let the highest score on a particular problem stand as opposed to the most recent score. Um, I think it sort of makes up for the fact that the students aren't getting that detailed feedback and they are being graded on accuracy as opposed to being graded on their method. If a student understands the method in my class and I'm grading their written work, I tend to give a lot of partial credit and make sure that if they are understanding the process, that they're getting a lot of credit for that. Okay, again, there's no personalized, detailed feedback. There is the right, wrong feedback. And maybe I should change this slide. They are getting the feedback whether they're right or they're wrong. They are not getting feedback for what they ought to do differently. And the Webassign quizzes are being graded for accuracy. And the students have opportunities to submit lesson notes for extra credit. Not many students have done that during the spring 2021 semester. In the fall 2020 semester, I originally required the lesson notes, and it was a lot of work for the students. So they said, let's make that extra credit. I asked them, like, is this too much work? And they're like, yes, it's too much work. So we decided to make it extra credit. But the students that did it, they said, I really like the lesson notes though. I learn a lot from the lesson notes. I'm glad I have the lesson notes. Please don't take those away. Don't take away that resource because it's helping me tie all of the ideas together, because again, it's focused on concepts. The lesson notes are focused on concepts as opposed to just being focused on types of computations. But it does take a lot of time to do that well. So I said, here are all your lesson notes. Here they are blank. Here they are completed. Check your work against my answer. This is on the honor system. If you fill out the lesson notes with your own work in your own handwriting, you will get extra credit for these lesson notes. And that encourages the students to tie the ideas together. And the lesson notes are worth 4% of their grade in the class. So if they have an 86% going into the final or after the final, and they get do all the lesson notes, and they get 4% extra credit, and their 86 would go to a 90. And you might say, well, that's a really big jump, 86 to a 90 just for doing some notes. If they do those notes, they're probably going to have a very high grade anyway, because they're going to understand the material. But I would say that project, that process of doing that is really going to help them learn so much more, that the 4% is warranted, in my opinion. And then they have a comprehensive final exam via Webassign. Again, I'm using Webassign, excuse me, a Webassign final as opposed to a paper-based final, because they've been doing Webassign quizzes all semester, and I don't want to just spring a paper-based final on them when they're not accustomed to the types of paper-based exams and quizzes that I tend to write. Like I want them to be prepared. So I think it makes the most sense, in my opinion, to use a Webassign final, because I'm using the Webassign quizzes all semester long in analytic geometry and calculus 3. I think the course design is good. I've got the videos and the lesson notes. They have the Webassign homework, and then they have a corresponding quiz. They have 4 attempts to submit, or they have 2 quizzes and 4 attempts for each problem within each quiz to submit. So it's kind of like 8 attempts. It's hard to describe. And the highest score stands between the 2 versions of the quiz, as opposed to the recent score. So I am relying a lot on the software for this. I'm relying a lot on Webassign, and I'm constrained by the fact that I have to work with their problems. And they're good problems, and they have recently offered me access to other textbooks which is wonderful. That means I can write a better final exam, a final exam that covers more concepts and will not necessarily include the problems that they've already seen on the homework and the quizzes, which is what you want. You want to be able to assess them using a new problem, not just a problem that they've already done before. But again, we're having to rely on sort of the vision of someone else. And I'm all for like the freedom, the academic freedom of a professor to say, you know, this is really important. This is really important. This is what I want my students to take away, and to be able to craft homework assignments and assessments that align with what your goals are for their takeaways. If your goals are aligned with the textbook authors, it works out great. But if you have something more in mind than the textbook author does, then you're kind of stuck unless you know how to write questions. Okay, so I'm doing that in Calculus 3, and you might say, okay, well, what's missing? And this was supposed to come in later, but that's the pandemic for you. Pandemic stressors. So what's missing online? So I've taken standards-based grading from the face-to-face environment where it worked so well, and now I'm doing it online with these Webassign quizzes in Calculus 3. And I've highlighted the aspects of what worked for standards-based grading that don't work as well in the online design. So I'm going to list all of those things that work over here. So the seamless alignment and design is not there as it was before, because again, the lesson notes and the videos were originally designed for the face-to-face standards-based grading course, and they're aligned with those objectives that I had for the students that would have been assessed on a paper-based quiz that I had written, but instead I'm now assessing it with Webassign quizzes. So the alignment is not seamless now. There are definitely seams in this course design because I have not recreated everything to align with the Webassign materials. Another thing that's missing is the mindset training. Like, I can send them a beautiful TED Talk by Carol Dweck about, is it Carol Dweck? I think so. I'll just call her Dr. Dweck, about mindset. I can send them that, but there's no guarantee that they will watch it. And we're not going to have the same talks that we would traditionally have just after class, before class, in the math lab, during office hours, all of that, where we talk about, you know, where we have the pep talks, and we talk about the fact that you can learn from your mistakes, and that this quiz is just a temporary snapshot. It does not define you. It does not make you stupid. If you don't know how to do this right now, it doesn't mean you're not going to know how to do it tomorrow. You could learn it by tomorrow. You know, all of those talks, like, that's not happening in the online environment the way it would have happened face-to-face. Now, I don't know that we can make it happen the same way that it would have happened face-to-face, but there has to be another way to do that mindset training, and do it in a way that works. Like, I don't want it to feel like one of those tutorials that you go to for, you know, like one of the trainings for work. I'm so sorry to the people who make those trainings, and I'm practically making one myself right now as I criticize it. You know, when you're watching those videos and you're like, okay, and I can do the quiz at the end, and you're like, yep, I'm a safe driver now because I spent 40 minutes of my time learning about safe driving. Like, I don't know that actually made me a safer driver. I don't know that doing that for mindset and growth mindset would help as much as human interaction with a teacher that's like, hey, it's okay, I've been there, you know, like having that conversation. So that's one of the things that's missing online. They still have incentives for studying because they still have the opportunity to reassess. One other thing that's missing is the organically forming study groups. They're not forming. They feel isolated, and I've highlighted that down here as well. They don't feel like their classmates or teammates because everybody is doing all of these Webassign quizzes and assessments. They're doing all of this alone at home, and they're watching YouTube videos at home by themselves. And I encourage them to form study groups, and I encourage them to talk to each other. But I don't think that they're doing it during the pandemic. They still have, deadlines for accountability only. There is a late penalty. Like you have to get your quizzes done for full credit by this deadline. And then after this deadline, the highest grade you can get is a B. There's a harsher late penalty for homework in the online class. Just because of my own experience with online students, they really seem to need that harsher penalty in order to get them to do their homework on time. And in Calculus 3, if they don't do their homework on time, they're not going to pass the course. They're not going to finish the course. So I do have some deadlines and some late penalties in the online course, probably more than I do in the face-to-face course. But it's, again, designed to help keep the students accountable. And if it were up to me, they would have no deadlines. Like I would say, you can do it all the way up until the final, that's fine. But having that accountability helps them. So I still have deadlines for some accountability, and I've sort of tweaked the late penalties based on my experience with the students. They still have a professor or coach in their corner, but again, they can feel isolated. They can forget that I'm there. Even though I send them a weekly email every week, it's very easy to feel isolated. And they are missing out on the personalized, detailed feedback that they would have gotten on a paper-based quiz. And I think that that's huge. The lack of the personalized, detailed feedback and the lack of the organically forming study groups and the mindset training with your professor/coach, the seamless alignment, like I'm going to say everything that I'm doing about the online Calculus 3 class is good, but it could be so much better if I could find an online equivalent for these organically forming study groups, doing something else online so that classmates feel like teammates, and doing some other kind of activity on a regular basis, but almost spontaneously, almost organically, in the same way that it happened face-to-face for mindset training. Like all of that should happen. And ideally, all of the course materials, including the lesson notes and videos, would be redesigned for the quizzes that the students are taking. And yeah, I'm considering that actually. I'm considering creating a Calculus 3 Webassign playlist that would be aligned with the materials that the students are using there, or the quizzes and the exams that the final exam that the students will be taking. To create that seamless alignment. But I really think that there are going to be some pieces and some ideas from Calculus 3 that would be missing if I did that, if I aligned to the textbook as opposed to asking the textbook to align to me. So we've got all this going on where the students don't have these things that I've highlighted. They're not getting that. But they are getting the incentives. They do have deadlines for accountability. They do have me on their side. They've got all of that going for them. And then you add on top of that the stressors of the pandemic. Living in a pandemic is hard. Even if you are extraordinarily privileged like myself, like I have a great job. I'm doing great. I'm very fortunate. It's still stressful for me. It's still hard for me sometimes. And I can't even imagine what it would be like well, I mean, I can only imagine, let's say that. I can only imagine what it's like to not have like the stable job and the wonderful career that I have right now as we're going through this. And my students are in school often because they're trying to get there. They're trying to get to that amazing career and they don't have it yet. And now there's a pandemic and they're trying to learn at home and this is hard. And so consistent with that empathy piece, that empathizing with the student experience, we need to acknowledge that and say, okay, well, in this environment, what is the best way to still not set the bar lower, because getting people through a program is not the same as giving them an education. I want them to get through the program, but I also want them to learn while they're here. Like the learning is the most important part. So we want them to learn, but we have to say, okay, given that they're in a pandemic, given that we're learning online, how can we do this better? And I don't mean to sound negative at all, because I mean, I think we have amazing technology. This would definitely not have been possible 20 years ago. What we've done in the last 2 years, I'm very proud of the work I've done, and I'm proud of the work my colleagues have done. And I'm very proud of how my students have worked so hard to not give up on their goals and continue pursuing their education. But saying all of that, we've got to empathize with the things that aren't working, with the student experience, the fact that this is hard, and say, okay, given that reality, how can we design, what ideas could we implement so that we are giving our students, our online students, the same type of experience that they were getting face to face? And it won't necessarily, I said that wrong. It's not necessarily going to be the same type of experience that they're getting face to face, but it should be an equal education. It should be equally valuable, and they should come out with the same skills and or at least a comparable set of skills to what the students were experiencing face to face. Okay, we're still a family. I'm still like I guess Mama Bear. I'm still like the coach in this little family, this little calculus family. Um, and it really does feel more like a coach or a team atmosphere than a family, but I still see myself in that role. Um, but it's like we need a family meeting. Like how are we going to make this better? How can we create the sense of community that leads to mindset training and teaching each other in study groups, all of those things? How can we do that? I can work on the seamless alignment, can do something else, some other activity for personalized feedback. Maybe not in the homework, but something else. We could come up with something else to address those things. But given all of that, and the fact that we're in a pandemic and life is hard, and there are a lot of people that are struggling, and there are varying degrees of privilege, we just need to address all of that. Okay, so that was for Calculus 3. I have a certain course designed for Calculus 3 because of the nature of the material, and because of the nature of the material, I felt comfortable using an online homework platform to do homework and quizzes and the final exam. Feel differently about differential equations. With differential equations, it's all about the method. It's all about the process. So I really needed to see that process for my students. So I did things differently in differential equations. I'm teaching online differential equations and online live, which is a synchronous online differential equations class via Zoom twice a week, Tuesday and Thursday. So in both of these classes, the students have access to my Zoom lectures and supplemental videos. In the online version of differential equations, the expectation is not that the students would go to the Zoom lectures, but that they would watch the supplemental videos. But they have the option to watch the Zoom lectures if they want to. In my online live differential equations class, it's the other way around, but it's the same thing. The expectation is that you would come to lecture twice a week via Zoom. And then you have supplemental videos. Those are the lectures that the online students are watching to sort of fill in any gaps, to see additional examples. And actually, I think the supplemental videos are great because in a Zoom lecture in an hour and 20 minutes, I only have so much time, and I have to, get through the material. I have to cover these things, cover these examples, and then we're done. But with the supplemental videos, I can take a little bit more time. And if watching the videos takes too long, you can always watch me at twice the speed or 1.5 times the speed. I do that with videos all the time. And I won't be offended if you watch me very fast. That's there for students that need it. The students have two options. They have the condensed version of the material twice a week in the Zoom lectures. And then they have the expanded version of the material where I'm really breaking down all of the all of the arithmetic, all of the algebra, all of the calculus 1 and calculus 2 prerequisites, and I'm breaking them down in great detail. I'm doing that in the Zoom lectures as well, but I have to do it fast. In the supplemental videos, I can take my time. So that is there for the students in the online and online live differential equations class. And everything is aligned with the written homework. The Zoom lectures are, and the supplemental videos are aligned with the written homework as well. Um, then they also have class notes and online homework. Now, the class notes are not perfectly aligned. They're actually based on an old textbook that I used years ago. It's actually a textbook that I love, but I'm not following those notes anymore. It's been so many years since I started teaching differential equations. I think I taught it for the first time in 2007. Um, that I don't use those notes very much anymore. I'm going to rewrite all of my differential equations notes this summer. So those notes are available as a summary of the material for students who want them, but I'm not relying on those. So there's imperfect alignment between the notes and the videos. I will say for the first week of class, Introduction to Differential Equations, I stick to those notes pretty well. But after that, um, I'm a little less tied to the notes. I do things a little differently now. And then we also have online homework that was based on a new textbook, and there's imperfect alignment there. So there are methods that the textbook authors are using when they solve a problem, say using reduction of order. They're using a different method than I have my students use. I do everything from first principles, and the textbook author of the book that I'm using right now likes to use a formula rather than using first principles. One of my students asked me, he's like, why is it called reduction of order? He didn't realize that, through a substitution, a second order differential equation became a first order differential equation. And then we solved that. We were reducing the order from second order to first order. And if you follow the method from first principles, the name of it makes perfect sense. But if you just plug things into a formula, it feels like plugging things into a formula and it doesn't make perfect sense. So there is a misalignment between the help features offered by the online homework and the way I'm teaching some of the concepts in class, as well as the class notes. Now, I told my students I am fine with the students seeing material from multiple sources. I actually encourage them to have multiple sources. Like I have 3 differential equations textbooks on the table behind me that I refer to all the time. If I want a new take on a certain method, if I want to read a different discussion, I read a different textbook author. And so I absolutely encourage the students to learn multiple approaches. But when it comes to something like mastering a method for solving a particular type of differential equation, sometimes the fact that your teacher does it differently than the online homework platform can cause some problems as the students like learn one method, they also kind of learn another, they kind of learn both, but they don't know either one very well. And then they turn in a hybrid of the 2 methods that doesn't actually make any sense. So that's a bit of a problem. So I've got class notes and online homework for my online and online live differential equation students, but there's imperfect alignment. And I just really haven't had time yet to redo all of the class notes, but I'm going to do that this summer and everything is going to be aligned really well in the fall. I'm super excited about that. But in the online live and online differential equations class, I'm using paper-based quizzes as opposed to quizzes on the computer. And I think that that's a much better solution because with the quizzes on the computer, the students are just typing their answer in at the end, typically. They're saying, y of t equals this particular function of t. And there's no record of the method. And for me, when I'm teaching differential equations from first principles, my concern is mostly that they understand the principles underlying the method, not that they necessarily get a perfect answer at the end. I want them to get a perfect answer at the end because that means their method is right, but the answer isn't the thing, the reasoning is the thing. So I use those paper-based quizzes in the online live and online differential equations course. I used to do about between 9 and 10 quizzes for the online and online live differential equations. I'm using 7 quizzes in a semester. I'm doing less quizzes that cover more course standards. I'm choosing to do that because of the logistics of grading paper-based quizzes that have been submitted through scanned documents. It just takes a very long time to get all the scans sort of organized and labeled and filed and then graded on the iPad and then, filed somewhere else and then emailed to the students through links. Like it takes a very long time. So rather than doing 9 to 10 quizzes a semester, I'm doing 7 quizzes in a semester. which is feasible. I want to be able to deliver on the promises I give my students, and that means I need to make my work feasible. And you guys understand that. These are proctored via HonorLock on Blackboard or in the testing centers. I give my students personalized written feedback. I use an iPad to mark up their work, and then I post their work, in a folder on OneDrive, a drive, and then I send my students a private link for them to download their quiz with feedback. And here work is graded for the methods and evidence of understanding as opposed to just the accuracy at the end, which I think is a much better system than what we're doing in Calculus 3. But in Calculus 3, it just wouldn't be feasible to do that for all of those quizzes. And I think also the types of problems that they're solving in Calculus 3 can be better assessed using an online homework platform, whereas differential equations is not assessed very well online. But with online and online live elementary differential equations, my students have reassessment opportunities. And this is different. With reassessment before, my students would come to office hours, which I would have 10 hours a week. And I usually have an evening office hours, or at least one night a week where I had evening office hours. And then I would have office hours during the day, 3 or 4 days a week during the day. Usually it was Monday through Thursday. Occasionally I'd have a few hours on Friday morning or something like that. But with the reassessment opportunities, then they would just walk into the math lab or walk into my office and say, I'd like to reassess. And we'd go to the printer and I'd print something for them. And then I'd give them the quiz and they'd take it and then they'd turn it in and they were done. And that was how reassessment worked. It was actually, it was very simple. Now, the way I'm doing reassessment is the students are submitting a video of them working a problem over the same course standard. So let's say that they wanted to reassess over a separable differential equation. So they would go to their homework, they'd find the separable differential equation or separable differential equations on the homework. They'd pick one or two. Usually they just pick one, pick a representative problem, and then they'd make a video and they'd look at the camera and they'd say, hi, Miss Townsend, my name is, John Smith, and this is a reassessment over this topic. And so they would introduce themselves and then they work the problem and then they explain the process to me. They say, first I did this and then I did this, and they're explaining it to me in much the same way that I've modeled it for them. I've been explaining it to them in my videos all semester. And then after watching the video, I give them some feedback. I say, this was good. This was good. Oh, but you have the right idea here, but maybe you labeled it incorrectly, or you called that y sub p, that was the right hand side of the differential equation. Let's not call that y sub p. I'll get into the details and give them some feedback based on their video submission. And then after that, they set an appointment with me. I just create a Zoom meeting for us. And at our Zoom meeting, I give them a new problem to work and they can work it on their own. And then when they're finished working the problem, then we go over it together. And if they need help at any part of that problem, I will help them so that every student will be able to finish the problem in their reassessment quiz. But if they need a lot of help, their score is going to go down. So if they can't evaluate the integrals in, say, a separable differential equation where you've got an integral on the left and an integral on the right, if they can't evaluate those integrals, then they can't get a grade above a 1.5, which is like a C minus or a D plus. I need you to at least evaluate one of those integrals correctly in order to get a C. And I need both of them to be correct to be eligible for a B or an A. So the students submit a video and then they have basically an oral exam or a live quiz with just one problem, where they work through the problem and then they explain how they worked it, and then I help them out when they need it. And then based on their work and based on our discussion, I assign a grade. And then of course they have the opportunity to reassess. They're only allowed to do one of these a week. And so that's how that works. So you might say, okay, well, what's missing in the online differential equations class? Same types of things as before. The seamless design isn't quite there because the notes haven't quite been aligned yet. I'll redo that this summer. the mindset training, a little bit. There's a little bit more mindset training. We can talk about that during our Zoom meetings. We can talk about, learning from your mistakes and all of that. But again, it's not happening as organically and naturally, I'd say, as it used to happen face to face. They still have incentives for studying. They still have deadlines for accountability only. They have a very small late penalty. They have a professor coach in their corner. And I am, pretty lax about deadlines often. They'll say, well, when is this due? I'm like, just get it in by the finals week, or it'd be best if you got it in by next Tuesday, but if you need a little bit more time, that's fine. And so that's certainly part of this deadlines for accountability only. I want to have deadlines to keep them on track. I don't want to have strict deadlines for no reason if it's not really serving them. I tried to make my deadlines to keep my students accountable, to keep my grading feasible, so that I can deliver on the promises that I make for them. I think we have a little bit more of a teamwork atmosphere. The students still tend to feel a little bit more alone than they did face-to-face. And then we have the logistics of reassessment and grading. It takes time to make those videos, and it takes time to watch those videos. It takes hours longer to download all the files from the various sources and label them with the appropriate labels. And if a student, needs to send me their quiz as 5 different like JPEG files, I need to save each one of those JPEG files and label them, page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4, page 5. And then I need to, bring them into combinedpdf.com and then put all 5 files in the right order and then combine them. And then I need to relabel them and save them under the student's name. And then I put that in a folder. And once that folder is full of all the papers I'm going to grade, then I put that folder online, and then I take that folder and I download it to my iPad, and then I mark the papers, I grade them, and then I upload them, and then I send links. Hours, takes hours. Those logistical hours are not spent doing math. They're spent sorting and labeling files, which is a little bit, I would say, frustrating, but I guess it's part of the job, and it's okay. It's just not very efficient, and I wonder what we could do to make it more efficient. So the sense of community, the organically forming study groups, the mindset training, the seamless design I can work on, and I'm open to suggestions for reassessment and grading. But this is everything else, the incentives for studying, the deadlines only, a professor or coach, all of that is still there. But the other pieces, these missing pieces, make a big difference as far as the student's learning is concerned. You take those pieces being missing, and they're missing just because it's an online class. That's like really the biggest difference. And you add on the pandemic stressors, and then you say, okay, well, what can we do differently? Online Sbg, I think, is still better than 3 tests and a homework grade for most students. But still, it's not comparable to what they were getting face-to-face. And it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be identical to what they were getting face-to-face, but it does need to be comparable. I think every student deserves an excellent education. And just because you can't come to campus doesn't mean that you shouldn't have just all of the things that you need for success. So I added this slide today. I'm gonna get my little face out of the picture here. I saw this on LinkedIn and I thought it was wonderful. You might not think this is related to equity at all, or related to things like diversity and inclusion. But, oh, it is. It is. Empathy and equity are intimately linked. When we design with students' needs in mind, we have to think about the diversity of the students that are in our classrooms. We have to think about who we're serving. and what their needs are. And when we think about who we're serving and what their needs are, we're not only creating student-centered courses, we're creating equitable courses. But I saw this graphic on LinkedIn, which I thought was wonderful, about intersectionality. And it was talking about privilege and discrimination. But I don't tend to think of it as like, oh, I'm privileged in this area, but I'm discriminated against in this other area. I'm definitely trying to stay away from a victim type framework. But I will say that there is a sense of privilege in all of these areas and a sense of lack of privilege in all of those areas. We are all privileged in some ways and not privileged in others. We all have strengths and weaknesses. We were all born with, different temperaments, different gifts, and obviously, there's often a divide at birth. Some of us were born with a lot more privilege than others, but it's not about, for me, saying, check your privilege, or making people feel bad about things that they can't control. Like a white person can't control being white, any more than I can control being Asian. But we should be aware that if we happen to be in the dominant racial group, that we are in a position of privilege, a position of some power. And if we are heterosexual, there's some privilege there. And if we're not, then there's a lack of privilege there. And it's not necessarily intentional discrimination, but these are factors that affect all of our students. So their race, their ethnicity, their gender identity, what class they're in. And I'm not talking about which math class they're in, although that's true too. Talking about things like socioeconomic status, the languages they speak, the religions that they believe in, their academic ability, their emotional abilities, cognitive, IQ and emotional IQ, their sexuality, their mental health, their age, their education, their body size. All of these things are factors. They're, I think of like video games, and you have all those little scales as you get different, you have like a certain, I don't know, like a certain strength, and you have like a certain amount of it. And I actually don't know very much about this at all. I know people who play video games. I do not personally play video games. I've never been a gamer except for when I was like 8. But I guess what I'm saying is that there's a scale on each of these things, and it's like privilege, lack of privilege, privilege, lack of privilege. Sometimes you're in the majority, sometimes you're in the minority. Sometimes everyone will listen to you, sometimes everyone will dismiss what you say. And it really depends on the lens that you're looking at all of this through. But when you design a course, a student-centered course, we have to when we're keeping students' needs top of mind, we have to think about these things. We have to think about implicit bias. We have to think about the fact that if you are in the majority for all of this, but you have a severe mental illness, I mean, the fact that you have privilege in all of these other areas may help you, but if you have a very severe mental illness, oh man, life is harder because you have that mental illness. You might be ostracized because you have that mental illness. You have this weakness, and I'm just using that as a particular example. You have, and there's an aspect of yourself that makes you different, and all of these are just differences. And because of your difference, it sometimes means that you aren't the alignment, like we were talking about with everything else, like the alignment between the environment and who you are isn't the best fit. And when we design courses, we need to, we always talk about differentiated instruction. That's like an old buzzword, old education buzzword about differentiated instruction. Well, we need to keep all of this in mind, that there are all of these different ways where we have privilege and lack of privilege, and that they overlap and they combine, and these do not define us, but they are part of what make us who we are. And so as we think about how to better serve our students, we need to think about how to address students in every category over here, of every race, ethnicity, gender identity, class, language, religion, ability, and so on. And realize that every one of those students is like up, privileged here, not privileged here, a little bit of privilege here, a little bit of less privilege here. Their parents had a lot of books at home. That might be one of the things. Or their parents never went to college. They're a larger person, like physically larger, wear larger size clothing. Like that, that would be less privilege. But their parents have PhDs, so that goes up, and you have all of that sort of intersecting and overlapping and making that student who they are. And you don't want to say, oh, you're an Asian person? Well, I know lots of things about stereotypes about Asian people. As an Asian American, I would say, there are many things that you think you know about Asian people that don't apply to me personally. And, there is no monolithic Asian person experience. I need to stop preaching about this now. But my point is that when we design for students' needs, when we are talking about empathy with our students, we need to keep all of this in mind. And we need to realize that all of us have privilege in some categories and not less privilege in others. And when we're trying to create an empathic classroom, and I don't know if it's empathic or empathetic, I have to ask the English professors, as we're trying to create a classroom that's like that, we're creating an equitable classroom. Like, equity means keeping all of this in mind and saying, I am designing for you. I am, creating scaffolds wherever we need them, because this is for you. This education is for everyone, especially at a place like Tulsa Community College, where education is supposed to be for everyone. Education for all. We accept everybody who applies, and that's not meant to say anything bad about us, but it is to say, okay, if we are going to accept everybody who applies, we better deliver on the promise of giving them an excellent, high quality, affordable education. And that means tailoring the educational experience to this, or to all of this and more, to who our students really are and what our students really need, but without lowering expectations, without lowering the bar, without saying, oh, because you're in this category, I'm going to expect less. I would never do that to my students. I believe that they are all capable, but some are going to need more scaffolding than others. And we absolutely can put that scaffolding in place if we're thoughtful and we're trying, and hopefully the students are also aware that we're trying to. And as we try to do all of this, we're going to do it imperfectly. And it's going to be a test, iterate process where we try something and it fails, and it tries something and it's failing. We try something and it works, but there are these ways that it needs to be tweaked, and we try it and we tweak and we try and we tweak and we try and we tweak every semester from now on. So I'm just going to close with my holiday ham story. I made a video about this briefly before. This is something that I heard at church years ago. So here's the idea. Supposedly this happened. Who knows if this actually happened or not? But there's a young woman, she's making ham with her mother, and her mother is explaining to her how they make the ham, and she's going through the step-by-step process, and the mom says, okay, the first thing we do is we cut this thing off. We cut off the end. And the daughter was like, why do we cut off the end? And her mother said, because my mother told me to cut off the end. That's why I do that. And she's like, oh, I don't know. I don't know why we do that. So she went to her mom and she's like, well, mom, why do we do that? And then her mom was like, oh, I don't know. Eventually they went back to the matriarch of the family, the person who had taught them all how to make this ham. And they asked her, they're like, why do we cut off the ham? And they're like, oh, she said, because of I had this little oven, and because of the pan and the oven and just the way everything was, the only way the ham would fit was if I cut it off and then I could put it in the oven. And so for generations, they were making this ham, they were throwing away perfectly good food, um, cutting something off and getting rid of it. They were doing that um, because uh, of something that was no longer necessary. They were doing that because of constraint that was no longer there. And so um, that's something to keep in mind. Like why, we often do that. We often keep the status quo going. We do things that are consistent with our status quo. Um, because it's the way it's always been done. Like, why do we give 4 exams and have a homework grade? Because that's how everybody else did it in math. That's what we're accustomed to. You do the homework every week, and then every 4 weeks there's a big spike in your studying, and then there's a little bit of a lag in your studying, and then there's a spike in your studying again after you study. And so the graph is like this: how much you study. Um, like that's how we used to do things, but there's no reason to do that anymore. Just like there's no reason to keep cutting off part of the ham in order to make it fit in this pan or this oven anymore. Um, Sometimes we need to just to rethink the status quo and say, if it's no longer serving us or it's no longer serving our students, maybe we should do something differently. So with that in mind, I've got these questions for you. It's not about standards-based grading. Sometimes people think that I'm like the big proponent of standards-based grading. I love standards-based grading. My students love standards-based grading, but you know what? It's not about standards-based grading. Standards-based grading is something that allows us to meet or to enact a whole bunch of best practices at once. And it works just very well in a face-to-face environment because it allows us to implement all of those best practices. But it doesn't quite translate to the online environment, as we've seen for the reasons we've seen. The incentives for studying are still there. Having a coach is still there. But the other aspects of it, the organically forming study groups, the mindset training, all of those things that are very personal and related to coaching don't happen in the online environment, at least not organically. We're going to have to be much more intentional about it. So I really need your help. I want to crowdsource our wisdom without any concern about who gets the credit. Like, let's talk about solving these problems. So my question for you is, how do we create that seamless environment or seamless alignment in the online environment? And that may involve, maybe relying less on publisher materials. I want to write a textbook. Like I love calculus books. If you go to my library at home, you'll see just a ton of calculus books and other books from other, I love books. I love physical books. But I also like to ask conceptual questions, and I have different emphasis than the textbook authors might have. I want to create a different emphasis than they do sometimes. And I think most faculty feel that way. So given that, how do we create seamless environment or seamless alignment between the material that, the content that we're teaching and the practice that the students are doing, and from the practice to the assessment? How do we help study groups form naturally online? I saw a great example with this program called Packback recently that they're using in English classes. Might be able to do something like that, something social media-ish. So it doesn't have to be social media, but something like it where students engage with each other in some way. I've heard a lot about Discord. Maybe that could be a way that students could form study groups naturally. How do we incentivize studying? That's part of what makes standards-based grading so great, is that it provides an incentive for studying because it ties the grade, um, which is what they want, to a measure of something that they're actually learning. And as they learn more and their grades go up, that's providing incentive for studying more so that they learn more, so that their grades continue to go up. That's great. And you might want to continue to do that and do standards-based grading online. But that's not the only way to do that. There might be other ways, better ways to incentivize studying. Consistent with that, how do we make assessment work for our students? Somebody gets a 75 in pre-calculus. All I know is that they got a C. I don't really know what they know about pre-calculus. We want these numbers to mean something. And if they're going to mean something, that means breaking the material into bigger or into smaller pieces so that the number actually measures something in particular. If the numbers measure something in particular and the students have the opportunity to improve those numbers, kind of like a leaderboard, or like they used to do it. I went to one or two, I think it was two, what is it called? CrossFit sessions. I decided that was not for me. That I'm much more of a moderate exercise type girl. That was like way too intense for me. But one of the things that works about CrossFit is that they put everybody's numbers up there, and you can sort of compare to people who are at a similar level with you, and you can compete if you want to compete with your friend, and it sort of helps push people to be better on that sort of competitive environment. I'm not talking about making assessment competitive with our students. I don't think that that would generally work for most of our students, but the ability to see a number and to raise it, to be able to compete with yourself, like that is a beautiful thing. And even if we don't use standards-based grading, well, I think standards-based grading works very well for that. But even if we don't use standards-based grading, is there another way that we could make assessment work for our students? So it was measuring what it intended to measure, and it could help the students grow, as opposed to just putting a label on them that says, this is how good you are at something, when obviously how good they are at something can go up and it can go down as well. How can we make assessment more efficient as far as like getting the quizzes to them, grading them, getting them back to them? How can we make that whole process more efficient? I think some AI really would help, especially when it comes to grading. If we could get software, if we could design something that would provide personalized, detailed feedback the way a human grader would, immediately, the way that some of these online homework platforms are providing feedback to our students. They're saying immediately, no, you're right, or you're wrong, or yes, you're right. And we are, whereas if I grade the work, I have to say, well, give me a week. Let me spend some time looking at your work. Let me spend some time looking at your classmates' work, and let me get back to you. It's going to take some time. So I'm doing all of that. But what if we could give immediate feedback that was like feedback from me? One of my students said years ago, when I was working in the math lab, she wished she had a pocket Sasha. There was like a pocket, there's some kind of like pocket something doll or something that was out there where you could like have this like little doll in your pocket. And she was referring to me as being like a pocket Sasha. Like she wished that when she was stuck on something, that she could have a pocket Sasha. And I was like, could you imagine an AI, pocket professor, pocket grader, pocket, like somebody giving you very detailed, personalized feedback on your work immediately? Like, how fantastic would that be? And it may already be out there and I may not be aware of it, but if that's true, then somebody please tell me about it, and let's make it more widespread, because we need that. And then again, how can we provide personalized, detailed feedback more efficiently, which is consistent with what I was just talking about. So here are the principles from How Learning Works. This is 7 research-based principles for smart teaching. It talks about 7 principles, and then it talks about what the research says about those principles. The first principle is related to prior knowledge. So the question is, how do we correct deficiencies in prior knowledge? So students forgotten something, or misunderstandings in prior knowledge. They think that they know something, but they actually have misremembered it, or they are remembering it. Well, yeah, misremembered it is right. They're remembering it incorrectly. How do we help students organize their learning? That's another one. Standards-based grading really does that naturally, but organizing those ideas, that's usually done by the professor. That's done by the professor when I do standards-based grading. But how cool would it be if we could design courses so that the students were the ones who were conceptualizing those bigger categories? Um, Everyone's organization structure is a little different. It's been a long time since I've read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, but I remember that. I remember that there was something in that book about how people were organizing their learning differently. And oh, it was so good. And I need to reread that book. But how can we help students do that organization of learning? Like, we can organize it for them. And I think that that's great. And when we organize it for them and we do it so in a meaningful way, that helps the students sort of lock it into the structure of all of the ideas that they already have in their minds. But how cool would it be if they were the ones doing the structuring? How do we keep them motivated? I know one of the big things for me that I've noticed with my students is human connection keeps my students motivated, and understanding why we're doing what we're doing. And understanding also that they can improve, that they can learn. And that doesn't work through pep talks. People don't respond to, like, you can do it, very well, unless they have evidence that they can do it. And I really do believe that they can do it. But after the pep talk, there needs to be an opportunity for them to have a visceral experience where they gain evidence that makes them feel like, wow, I actually am capable. And so having some kind of test iterate process where they get to try and fail a little bit and then learn from that failure and grow and keep growing and watch themselves grow in competence, like, that has to be part of it. And that's, I think, a part of why standards-based grading is so popular. When they understand that process, that keeps them motivated. If they don't understand that process, um, then it's not likely to really work for them. Again, mindlessly retaking quizzes will not teach you anything. But then pep talks alone, positive thinking alone, won't get you anywhere either. I think it's believing that you can, and then creating an experience where you have evidence that you're actually good at this and that you're gaining in capability. That evidence and that visceral experience, that just sense of knowing in your nervous system that you have done something, it's going to stick with you so much more than somebody else telling you that you're smart or that you can do it. Like, you need to see that you're smart. You need to see that you can do it. And we need to give our students opportunities to lay that foundation. And when they have an opportunity to lay that foundation and it doesn't work out well, when they fail, they take a quiz and they get a grade that they don't want, we have to talk about growth mindset, and we have to help them reframe that perceived failure as an opportunity, like, or as a first learning experience, as the first iteration of something really wonderful, and to just help them to take that next step and keep going. That's what works for me. That's what works in my classroom. But there are other ways that we can motivate students as well. And we need to think about what would work best in the online environment. How do we help students develop mastery? How do we design interactive practice? Cooperative learning is great face-to-face, but we can't do that in a pandemic, and we can't do that in the same way online. We do have breakout sessions online, but we can't do board work in the same way in a Zoom classroom as we can in a physical classroom where you're allowed to get within 6 feet of each other. And then consistent with the interactive practice, after you have practice, you need some feedback. How do we give that personalized feedback and also make it timely? You know, the the online homework platforms provide timely feedback, but it's not personalized. A human grader provides personalized feedback, but it's not timely. How can we provide personalized, timely feedback? Let's design something. Let's create an app so that our students can get the feedback that they would get from a human grader like that. Then finally, how can we remove barriers in creating online communities? We know that the learning communities help, but there are barriers to it. It just doesn't happen as organically. So we need to remove the barriers and we need to do things. Maybe we can't expect it to happen organically. Maybe we need to put some things in place, some scaffolds, perhaps you might think of it that way, to get us to a point where we can have those online learning communities for something like math. Um, and then how do we help our students become self-directed learners? So much of online education is self-directed learning. But we want them to learn how to learn. And we also want them to have the social and emotional experiences that they would typically have face to face, that human connection, that understanding, that mindset training, that sense of community, that sense of family. These principles of addressing prior knowledge, organizing learning, keeping students motivated, developing mastery, creating the types of practice that work, providing the types of feedback that stick, creating a sense of community and creating self-directed learners. Like those principles are discussed, and the research underlying those principles and ideas for how to actually enact those principles in your classrooms, they can all be found in this book. And I think if you click this link, that it's the Amazon link for this book. Like this all needs to be incorporated as we think about design going forward. So I've got my design thinking slide up again. This is what they do at this Stanford Design School. They would say, oh, Sasha, I don't know if that's really design thinking. You kind of started with the idea and then you worked backwards with the empathy. But I think honestly, the idea came from the empathy as far as standards-based grading is concerned. After watching my students with that sort of scallop structure to their study habits, like you don't study and then there's an exam and you study and then you don't study and then there's an exam and then you study and you don't study and then there's a big exam and then you're really exhausted, but then you have to study because it's the final. And you've got this scalloped graph for the amount of studying students do. And also empathy for those students who are in calculus that can't factor, or in calculus 2 and they can't take a derivative, or you're in differential equations and you really don't know anything about infinite series or derivatives or antiderivatives, and they're going to the university without these sort of foundational skills to be able to succeed in a 3,000 and 4,000 level engineering program. Empathy led to standards-based grading because standards-based grading was about meeting that need for students to feel competent and to develop their skills and to have that justified competence and to have that metacognition where they have learned how to learn and they have learned how to structure or organize their learning, organize their thinking about various concepts. But design thinking does not start with the idea, it starts with the empathy. So I think this whole thing where we empathize, define, come up with ideas, prototype, and test, and then test, iterate, and test, iterate. We don't need to just test and prototype, test and prototype, test and prototype, although we do tend to do that with design thinking. We do tend to stay here for a long time. After we think we have empathized enough, then we go and stay here. Perhaps rather than staying in these last two categories, we need to loop back and do this all over again. Empathize with the students, define what we want them to learn, best practices, and then, okay, what is it that we're actually trying to do? Let's focus on the principles in the learning. Let's focus on, the prior learning that we want to create, the feedback, all of those things from Susan Ambrose's book. Let's talk about those research-based principles and our course learning outcomes and our program learning outcomes and our institutional learning outcomes and our students' needs and the environment that they live in and all of the intersectionality of their privilege and lack of privilege in all of these areas of their lives, and think of them as individuals, and keep all of that in mind and brainstorm and come up with something that works better than 4 tests and a homework assignment. Come up with resources for the students that have forgotten the things in other classes. Come up with a better solution for the personalized, detailed feedback that should happen immediately, as opposed to having to wait for the personalized, detailed feedback from a human grader, or not ever get personalized, detailed feedback, but instead get just feedback that is just you're right or you're wrong. They won't tell you why. And then let's try things and then test them. And if they don't work, throw them out and try something else, and do that over and over and over again. I think that's the key. I told my students a semester or two ago, I think it was the summer students, my summer 2020 students, that as I was doing my debrief session with some of my best students and I was asking them about their experience, I told them that I felt like I was treating them like guinea pigs. And I mean, they're not guinea pigs, obviously, but I said, you know, I'm having to test all of these ideas on you, and I didn't have to before. I had created, or not created, but I had adopted this system and fine-tuned and tweaked this system over years and years and years. And then the pandemic sent us home, and it was like I was starting from scratch. And I was like, now I'm trying all kinds of things with my current students, and sometimes failing, and I'm having to throw them out. And I mean, I'm at early stages in this iterative process of making my online courses better. And I told them that I felt like they were guinea pigs. And I forget what exactly it was my student said, but I remember she was really encouraging. And she was basically saying that it was okay. It was okay that I was treating them like guinea pigs because I was listening to them. And because I was listening to them, I was creating a better course that was more in line with the ideas that I had previously defined, and coming up with better ideas and taking the ideas of my students and incorporating those into the solutions to prototype and test in the fall 2020 semester and now in the spring 2021 semester. Again, the folks at Stanford might say that we need to do this faster. You don't test iterate 3 times a year. You need to do this every 2 weeks or maybe every week, and just try a little something, see if it works, try a little something else, see if it works. Just that's how this process is supposed to work, ideally how it's supposed to work. But we're sort of shooting from the hip here and doing the best we can with the situation we're in, trying to serve our students as well as we can. The students are working hard, and I know all the faculty are working hard, but there is something to be said about going back to empathy and repeating this whole process over and over and over again, and every semester going back to that empathy, and perhaps several times during the semester checking in, and if appropriate, if you can pull it off and the class is not going to be too upset if there's not a lack of continuity, because some students are going to want that continuity. Throw it out mid-semester if it's not working, do something else. I've done that before too. So that's the end of my presentation. If you have questions about this, or if you want these slides, just send me an email at sashatownsend@tulsacc.edu. I will show you 2 more slides. These are just links about standards-based grading and other people's vision for standards-based grading. I don't even know if those links still work. I created that list of links a very long time ago, but you might check that out. If you want the slides, I will post a link under the video. Thank you so much for your attention. If you stayed all the way to the end, I appreciate you. This is a big vision, and we are definitely all experiencing different versions of this pandemic, but we're all in this together. And I think now is the time to take advantage of the momentum and really reform online education and higher education in general to better serve our students. And I think that design thinking can help, and we need to think about equity. Equity is just intensely interlinked with empathy, and yeah, do all of those things. So have a good night, folks. Thanks again for watching.